Well, let me just take a moment to introduce Elizabeth Blair. We'll use your full name because it's a formal place. This particular show has been up since about 6 weeks now. And, well, I should let you tell about yourself more than, and your work, but we appreciate Liz coming and doing this talk like this. So I'll turn the time over to you.
All right, thank you, Alma. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I want to tell you a little bit about bogs, of course, since that's the subject of my show. I want to dedicate this talk to Jim Swartz, back there, who really inspired me to start taking photographs. I started out my adventure with photography by auditing a class by Jim Swartz. I don't know if anyone has taken digital art photography. Anybody? No. It was a wonderful class, and it's still a good class. Almost teaching it now. And my only goal in taking that class was to learn how to take photographs of orchids in the dark bog. I wasn't having good luck doing that. They were fuzzy, they were moving around, they were eluding me in every way. And so I signed up for the class, and my only program was to learn to photograph orchids, because I had been finding many of them in the bogs around my Northwoods cabin. But I fell in love with photography because Jim was such an inspirational teacher. And I think we have a lot of those at Southwest Minnesota State University. He mentored his students. He was very creative in the assignments he gave. He was supportive of everyone, and he was rigorous. What more could you ask? He gave us, I thought when I audited an art class that it would be easy sailing. Oh, you just make things. I can add that to my 12 credits, no problem. I was sinking 3/4 of the way into the semester, and I decided to drop. So I happened to be in Alma's office that day, and I was telling him about it, and he goes, "Oh yeah, all the faculty who sign up for art classes drop." And I walked out of there going, I'm not dropping. I'm not going to be one of the statistics. And really that kept me in the class. And I'm so glad that I stayed there, because we ended up, just like Alma's doing now, having a show at the end where we had to produce work. So by the time you finished, you printed your work, you hung your work, you started to feel a little bit like an artist, which was wonderful. So I really credit Jim for getting me to think differently about art. It just wasn't a way to capture orchids, it was a way of seeing. And I also have to credit him for the name of the show, which is Ways of Seeing, Bog Tapestries. He came up with that. And he actually invited me to have the show here. So it just goes on. When you talk about a mentor, it's a long-range relationship. So let's give him a hand. Okay, so I wanted to just say a word or two about dreams. We all have them. Sometimes they take a long time to come to fruition. Sometimes they never do. They just get left by the wayside. I wanted to be an artist my whole life. I had an art major in college, but I didn't think I could do anything with it, and I kind of gave up on it. So I just want to say that dreams sometimes do come true, and that it's never too late. And Susan's an example of that. She's been writing for many years, but lately she's had tremendous success. You know, things have just taken off. So I'm a real believer in dreams, and I hope all of you who have them, which is everybody, will find some of them, your most important ones, fulfilled. Because that's what I feel has happened to me with with photography and other forms of art as well. So I'm very excited about finally feeling like I can call myself an artist. Here I am in the gallery. It feels great. I wanted to talk a little bit about the show and my work, and then a little bit about bogs. I don't want to talk too long. I also want to see if you have some questions, either about my work or bogs, or anything else in the room. But I wrote down a few things so I wouldn't talk too long. You know, you can get rolling and you lose track of time. When I show my work, the first question I'm usually asked is why I decided to photograph bogs, a decision that seems to strike many people as odd. Anybody think it's kind of odd to photograph bogs? Maybe? First time you heard about it? Sure. But it makes perfect sense for me, given where and how I grew up. It's common knowledge that the physical landscape of our childhood is imprinted on us and often remains the place where we're most physically and spiritually at home. The writer Bill Home, who grew up in the open country of southwestern Minnesota, used to say he became anxious and claustrophobic in the woods, where he lacked the broad vistas of a prairie landscape. I was born and raised in Roseau, Minnesota, 9 miles south of the Canadian border, by parents who were both smitten by bogs. And so bogs became a deeply familiar landscape for me at an early age. My father valued bogs because they were a haven for nesting great gray owls, and my mother loved the bogs and the wet ditches of Roseau County because they were home to so many of Minnesota's most beautiful wildflowers. In March or April, while the snow was still on the ground, my mother would take my sisters and me into a small bog less than a mile from the Canadian border to see the trailing arbutus, one of the first spring wildflowers. She would insist that we kneel down in the snow to smell this tiny pink flower, saying, "That smell is better than the world's most expensive French perfume." And she was right. Even today, I can't pass by a trailing arbutus without kneeling down to smell it. And of course, their habitat is bogs. While I've loved bogs all my life, I never intended to photograph them. My bog tapestry body of work came about by accident rather than design. In the summers, I spend much of my time at my cabin exploring Itasca County's bogs in search of lady slippers, purple-fringed orchids, fairy slipper orchids, and other bog beauties. Many of the county's bogs contain 12 to 14 different species of wild orchids. The bog where the bog tapestry photographs were taken houses thousands of wild orchids, including at least a dozen different species, some of which are quite rare. And I have never seen another person in the bog. So they're also very solitary and peaceful places. One day, as I passed by a bog pool 3 feet in diameter at the base of a cedar tree in my favorite local bog, I was struck by the intriguing reflections painted across its surface. The next time I glanced at that pool, the reflections were completely different, and my bog tapestry project was born. I quickly learned that nature, the master artist, varies her canvases based on wind, weather, temperature, season, and the angle of the sun. I've been photographing this small pool for half a decade now, and its diminutive surface is still surprising me with new and intriguing compositions. My bog tapestry project has become an exercise in seeing, in noticing how varied and beautiful the familiar bog world that surrounds me can be. The concept behind my bog tapestries is similar to that of Monet's haystacks, poplars, and water lilies. A single object can offer the attentive viewer, or painter, or photographer, unending variety, given the differences in the way light paints that object from moment to moment throughout the day, the month, the year. I wanted to also say a little bit, and these are the ones that are all taken in the same little bog pool, which is about this big. And so you can take a look at them after the talk, and you can see the kind of variety that happens just based on wind, weather, and everything else. I want to say a little bit about bogs as well, because I realize many people have not been in one. How many people have been in a bog? 4. Great, okay. The bogs are one of the most unique aspects of Minnesota's natural heritage. They were first formed about 3,000 years ago after glacial Lake Agassiz retreated. And of course, they've been growing in depth ever since. The layers of peat are somewhere 10 to 30 feet deep in different parts of northern Minnesota. In the early 1900s, the state of Minnesota considered bogs barren wastelands that served no practical or economic purpose. Maybe some of you still think that way. Anybody? Barren wastelands that serve no economic purpose? From 1905 to 1922, Minnesota was eager to attract tax-paying settlers. Since most of the land in the south was already taken, drainage ditches were dredged out 1 mile apart across vast stretches of bogland in the north central and northwestern parts of the state. Some 1,500 miles of ditches were dredged in Beltrami County alone. And actually you can still see every one of those ditches more than 100 years later. They're there, but the bog is as wet as it ever was. Politicians hope to lure immigrants to the state to homestead the drained lands. Great plan, huh? Farm in the bog. The would-be settlers came, but one after another they lost their homesteads since it was impossible to grow celery on wetlands underlain by many feet of water-saturated peat. The Chungking Company, remember Chungking? Was responsible for getting a lot of Minnesota farmers to try to grow celery in bogs. It was suddenly a popular dish. They were selling a lot of Chungking chow mein with celery. They needed more celery. And so they were a part of this whole plan. So these poor settlers could not grow enough food for themselves and their families, much less have any surplus. And they were required to pay taxes on this land, this free land that they homesteaded. And none of them could pay the taxes. So there isn't a single one left, except there's one rice farming operation up in the Big Bog in northern Minnesota. Over the years since then, when it was clear that the bogs had failed, probably the 30s. By that time, everyone had lost their shirt. A number of other schemes for utilizing the state's peatlands were proposed and debated, including mining them for fuel or minerals and harvesting them for timber. Finally, a few decades ago, scientists concluded that bogs provide Minnesota with priceless ecological benefits by sequestering carbon and protecting rare and unusual plants and animals that are especially adapted to the oxygen-scarce environment in peat bogs. At this point, since there's a couple of students, my students in my 170 class, I wanted to say a couple things to tie in what we're looking at in that class with the subject at hand. Lit 170 is environmental literature, and we have been reading a book called Here You Are, which is about how what we do in the United States affects people all over the world. We've been reading about palm oil in Borneo and how that has devastated orangutans and other creatures that had lived in the forest that have all been cut down now in order to plant palm oil trees. So there's been a lot of destruction of very beautiful and natural areas, and we're going to be reading about the Amazon, and that's been a hugely devastated area. There's just snowballing, and some of it is McDonald's. Seriously, people are chopping down the Amazon jungles in order to grow raised beef to provide burgers for McDonald's. The connections are amazing when you find out how American habits and American consumerism are changing the world. Well, we have a kind of a success story in Minnesota because we have this unique environment. We have more bogs than any other state in the lower 48. Alaska, of course, has more. And we have a single bog, which has now been preserved, that's 500 square miles, bigger than some countries in the world. And it has now been set aside, and it's the big bog. I have some photos of it in the show. It's a beautiful place. And we're starting to see that bogs have some very real values. So there's a movie that you're free to watch afterwards. It's running continuously right now in the back. I'm in the movie, and so are 6 other people who are interested in bogs. And it's one of the interesting parts in the movie is about a federal research project that's being conducted right now in the Marcel Bog, which is in Itasca County where my cabin is. And it's going to go on for years. They're testing in the bog to try to see what's happening with climate change. So they've installed all kinds of equipment to capture the changes in the bog, and they're going to register what the bog can sequester. It sequesters carbon. We've always known that. It locks carbon down and takes it out of the atmosphere. So that's one of its biggest services to us. But scientists are also thinking now that the bog might be able to take all kinds of other toxic chemicals out of the air for us. So that's going to be part of the experiment as well. So, hi Bob, come on in, welcome. So that's going to be one of the projects in the bog as well. So there's all kinds of exciting things happening in our state, unlike some of the places we've read about in the class, that are, just absolutely disappearing, and the pristineness of them have vanished. We can say that in Minnesota, we've come to a realization that our bogs are valuable and maybe more important than economic activities in them. It's not true of all of them. Some of them are still being logged, so on and so forth. But the vast bulk of them will now be preserved. And I also just want to say one more thing. I'm keeping it short, I promise, but I just want to say one more thing that bogs do for us that's really wonderful. We have 46 different kinds of wild orchids in Minnesota. I just brought a selection of them here that I photographed. They're all from bogs. And the bogs mean, because we have more bog area than any other state in the lower 48, that means that we have more orchids than almost every other state in the country, including places like Florida and California. We have about the same number of species that they do. And we have this one, for example. I call it Bozo the bog orchid because it looks like a little clown. You can see it close up later. But that orchid is almost extinct in the rest of the lower 48. We have thousands of them in the big bog. And so we've preserved some very beautiful things that have a long, long history in Minnesota by keeping some of the bogs intact. So rah, rah, Minnesota. It's impressive, and it can be done in other places and hopefully will be. That's my hope anyway. So that movie will be available if anybody wants to watch it. And then I just want to close my little talk about art and bogs and photography by doing some thank yous. I have a lot to be thankful for. I received a 2015 State Arts Board grant, which has funded 6 different activities in different communities in Minnesota, and this is the last one. And I am really grateful for that grant. I also want to thank Minnesota taxpayers who voted to fund the Legacy Grant, which allows programming here at MAFAC, and also gives individual artist grants so that people can do the work they want to do and then actually have the funds to frame all the photos, which is pretty expensive if you're trying to do it without a grant. Then I also want to thank SMSU for granting me this sabbatical that freed up the time I needed to prepare for the 6 community events during my grant year. And I definitely want to thank the SMSU Art Department for inviting me to exhibit in the annual Fine Arts Faculty Shows and for being such good mentors, each and every one of them. And the English Department for support, congeniality, and commitment to our students. We grade a lot of papers because we love our students, not necessarily because we love grading papers. And then I would like to thank the audience for coming out. I'm really pleased at the great turnout. Thank you all so much. And last but not least, I want to thank Becky Weifels, who is now co-president of MAFAC, and Alma Hale, who is now, this is his first show, chair of the exhibit committee. And there are volunteers in this room too, who have worked with MAFAC as well. Jim has certainly done a lot for MAFAC and a lot for this show. He hung this wall straight, right? Perfectly straight. Yeah. All right, so I have a couple of activities here. I made a puzzle out of this photo, and there aren't very many pieces in it yet. It's kind of challenging. You can imagine it's got a lot of green parts to it. So if you want to try to put a couple pieces in the puzzle, that'd be great. It's coming along, but not too far yet. That's one thing. And then I have some skulls. So if anybody brought children, they can see if they can identify them. I found the 3 skulls in the back there in my bog. And haven't found a bear skull yet, and I have run into a bear in the bog. But I haven't, fortunately the bear is probably still alive. The skull. There's also a double voice poem over there above the birch bark moose. Some friends of mine wrote that for me, and it's about bogs. And they wrote it by each writing a separate poem and then getting together and trying to put them together, so you can read the one on one side, one on the other side, and you can also read it across. They call it double voice poems. So you can check that out. And I have an edition of the Minnesota Volunteer in the back, which has a really interesting article by the Big Bog manager. Jim's holding it up. Oh, yeah, that's a Brandenburg raven on the front. But they found a bomb this big in the Big Bog. And they couldn't figure out what it was doing there. And so Doug began to do some research to find out what this big bomb was doing in the bog. And he finally found out that just after World War II, Americans felt that they needed to do more training, and so they started running bombing missions over the Big Bog, this vast stretch where there were no roads and no people living anymore, just what they called an empty space. So they began dropping bombs in the bog for practice. Well, then somebody apparently said, a park manager, well, why don't we create some moose wallows for the moose? Because they struggle when they're hot. So they dumped a few of the bombs to create moose wallows too. And Doug came across this bomb recently and then started doing the research and found out about it. So there's an interesting article about the history of the big bog in the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer. This is for the January-February issue. So you can take a look at that. And then the last thing is I have a little activity for you, which I'm hoping some of you will participate in. I have pencils and paper back there. And what I'd like to ask you to do is help me name these photos. I've ended up labeling them, kind of telling you what you're looking at, but I would love it if people would just brainstorm and come up with crazy names for them. So I'm asking you to take a piece of paper and then write down the label that's on here. Leaf with orange fungus. Pretty boring, huh? Telling you what you're seeing, and come up with a name for it. So I would just love it if a few people would give that a try, and then leave them in the back where the paper and pencils are for me. And then if you want to leave your name and email, I'll let you know if I decide to use your name in my next show. All right, thank you so much for coming. And when you leave, if you could sign the guest book, that would be wonderful. I have a little guest book in the back there, which MAFAC makes for everyone who has a show here, which is very nice. And you can just put comments about the bog. You can say, I'm one of those people who thought bogs were wastelands, or whatever. But anyway, I would love to have you write in the book as well. So that's...
Liz, tell them about the orchid you discovered.
Oh, okay. Yep. I probably have told Marcy about this, but this was terribly exciting. You have to come up and see this because when it's over, because this orchid is about the size of my thumbnail. I've magnified some of these tiny orchids, about the size of my thumbnail. It's so tiny, and it's the second rarest orchid in Minnesota. And so I wrote an essay that I read at the Fine Arts Festival. Some of you probably remember it. I got 3 really wonderful people who come to all my orchid essay readings right here in this row. And I wrote an essay about this orchid. It's called the Rams Orchid. It's a lady slipper, actually. Smallest one we have. And at the end of that essay, I said, when I'm 90, I'll probably be hobbling into the bog with a cane, still looking for that elusive ram's head orchid. A month later, I found one. It was like, what? It was totally mind-blowing because they're so rare. And if you find them, you're supposed to call the DNR and tell them, because they have so few in the state. So I called the DNR, and they said, we're meeting you there. It's a secret location. You cannot reveal. And so the botanist from Duluth and the chief orchid man in the state, Welby Smith, whose book I call my Orchid Bible, showed up too, but he was too late. He missed us, and so he didn't get to see it. So Bruce, the botanist from Duluth, met me, and we went to see the orchid, and he said, Elizabeth, I have been looking for one of these for 20 years, and I'm the botanist in Duluth. What did you do? And I said, Bruce, I really wanted to find one. And he said, well, I do too. So after I left, he stayed another 2 hours looking, figuring, well, if there's one here, there's probably more, hoping he would find one himself. But he failed to find it. But anyway, the final thing about that little story is that about 2 weeks later, I got an email from Welby Smith, who is our orchid expert, saying, Elizabeth, you have done a service for orchid lovers everywhere. Oh, I'll treasure that comment. It made me so happy because I'm such an orchid fan. So that's this little orchid right here. It's a fancy little thing. And one of the things you should notice when you go and look at it, oh, you have a question?
You said that was the second verse.
I'm kind of hard of hearing.
You
Can
said
anybody
that
tell
was
me?
the second rarest orchid in Minnesota. What's the first rarest?
What's the first rarest orchid? If that's the second rarest.
Oh, that is, yeah, that's the second rarest.
What's the first?
Oh, the first. Okay. I haven't found one of those. Good question. It's very tiny. It's even smaller than this one. And they've only found maybe 2 of them. One near Itasca County, and I'm still hoping to find one. Thanks for bringing that up. But I haven't yet. It's a tiny little white one, which grows in bogs, of course, like most of them do, at least in the north. And that one, I'm forgetting the name of it. I'll think of it and I'll tell you. Okay? And when you go to look at it, notice something. There's one of the things this orchid does, and some others as well, is once it's pollinated, the lid, this little thing right here, slams down immediately. Its business is done. It's been pollinated now. Well, I was watching this orchid and photographing it, and there was a tiny little mosquito, it's a small orchid, the tiniest little mosquito I've ever seen in my life. And you can see it, it's in there. And about 10 minutes later, the lid slammed down. So I think I know what pollinates this orchid, but all the books say nobody knows what pollinates this orchid. But now I have to prove it. I have to sit in front of one of these orchids for about 3 weeks and wait and photograph it happening. I didn't take a picture of the next couple minutes when the lid slammed down. But anyway, take a look. That's what they do. They go inside the orchid and they mess around in there hoping to find some nectar. And then they don't find it usually. Some orchids have it and some orchids just fool them into thinking they're going to have it. And then they leave and they go to the next flower, and then the pollen rubs off on the next flower, and then more flowers are created. Little baby flowers come from the insect visiting the flower. So here's an example of orchid sex in action. Anyway, so you have a question? I better come to people who have questions.
I've always thought the forms of the orchids are fascinating.
Yeah.
And I always thought they came from Walmart or Trader Joe's in Minneapolis. Now, are orchids perennial? Do they propagate? How long do they live?
Yeah, great
I mean, if
question.
there's one, will there be 4 next year? Or?
Great questions, yeah. Our state flower, the showy lady slipper, takes about 10 or 15 years to blossom a plant. It takes a long time before you see that blossom. So they're probably at least 10 or 15 years old when you see them blooming. And if you find a clump, which I find in my bog, I find clumps of hundreds of them. If you find a clump of 50 of them, they're probably 25 to 50 years old, that clump, because they multiply in the same area. So some of the orchids are actually very old and long-lived. They think that lady slippers could last maybe even 100 years once they get off the ground and blossom. And then if they're pollinated, then you'll have a large colony nearby. But we have to worry about pollinators too these days, whether they're going to be around to help our orchids have sex and make children. So, but so far so good for orchids in the bog. We have a little more trouble with things like bees due to pollutants. Jan?
You had mentioned briefly about secrecy, and it's an area that you can't reveal. Touch a little bit on the need for the secrecy and for people to not know where some of these things are.
Okay, yeah, great question. I was surprised when I had gone to look at a Rams Orchid in Itasca State Park, and not true. I didn't find them anymore. I had read that they had them in Itasca State Park, so I went to the office and asked about them, and they said somebody dug them up. They said, we have another clump, but we're not going to tell anybody. As soon as we revealed their location, they were dug up in Itasca State Park. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
So people are becoming very secretive about certain orchids that are rare. And I've actually watched 8 different places around my cabin be dug up and have the orchids disappear. There was a bunch of purple fringed orchids, which are gorgeous things. I don't think I put any in the show, but and they were all dug up. Then there was a collection of about 50 yellow lady slippers, which are one of my favorites. And they disappeared. So I've watched clumps disappear. In the bogs, they're safe. Nobody goes in there. But if they're in the ditches, they're open game. So the DNR doesn't want to reveal the locations of sites, especially rare ones, because they know what will happen. The public, and some people don't realize, how vulnerable they are. And I've had people tell me at parties, "Oh, it's no problem. There's plenty of them. I dug it up to take it home and plant it in my yard." And I say to them, "Well, it's going to die." They go, "Oh no, it's been there for a year." It usually takes about 5 years for them to die, but they have a mycorrhizal association in the soil where they are, and when you move them, they don't have that anymore, and they don't thrive. They slowly die. And so people just don't realize that, and they think, "Oh, there's a clump of 30. I can just take 5. But that clump of 30 has probably been there for, 25 to 40 years. So it's a problem. And I was pretty much sworn to secrecy. I was taken to see a couple at Itasca State Park, which is why I was able to find one myself. If you don't see them in location, you can't find them from looking at a book. So they took me because I used the scientific name of the plant. I said a bunch of things that convinced them I was not the typical, "I've got a spade, can you find me an orchid?" And so they took me to see this orchid. I was practically in tears, I was so thrilled. And actually there was a clump of about 60 of them in Itasca State Park. Well, there's less now, unfortunately. But there's still maybe 30. And I visit them every summer, religiously. And I visit mine, which is all alone, in another part of the state, religiously every year or two. These are my pals, my buddies. And fortunately, the little one I found is still there because nobody was told. Although they did tell me after I brought them there that they had to take this orchid and put it in a book to prove it was there. That's what they told me. I said, "No, you can't. It has no chance of pollinating if you cut it." And so Bruce, the botanist who came down from Duluth, said, "I promise you, I won't let them do that." So far so good. But yeah, it's sad, but and I don't think if people really knew the fate of orchids and how fragile many of them are, that they would dig them up. But, I wrote another essay. I'm working on a book about wild orchids too, about digging one up myself. And I grew up with a mother who loved orchids. Anybody remember that essay? Yeah. I forget what I call it. Oh, ditch digger. I called it the ditch digger. That was me. So that just goes to show you, I have loved orchids all my life, but I wanted this orchid so badly, I dug it up. It was a beautiful, ragged, fringed orchid. Put it in my garden, it died. So some of us learn the hard way. You covet something, you want it, you think somehow because you love it so much it will grow, but that did not happen. So guilty as charged. And lots of people are until they realize, just what it is they've done. So, any other questions? If not, some names would be great. And there's a movie back there. There are about 12 of my orchid photos in there. And then the hydrologist for the Chippewa National Forest, the Barcel Bog project, the federal project, is speaking in there. And there's a bunch of other people there's a guy who does a radio show called Phenology, and he goes to the bogs. He loves orchids. He's a mailman in Grand Rapids, but he also has a radio show. And he's in the movie, and he absolutely loves bogs and takes people on tours of them sometimes if they contribute to the public radio station. They get to have a tour to see orchids in the bog. So there's some interesting people in the film as well, and I'm interviewed walking the boardwalk with the movie director and showing her some things along the boardwalk, pitcher plants and sundews and other, bog rosemary, other things that grow probably only in bogs, most things that grow only in bogs. Any other questions? Time to name that bog pool. It'd be great.